In the exclusive enclave of East Hampton, New York, where sprawling estates line pristine beaches and old money mingles with new, the murder of financier Ted Ammon sent shockwaves through one of America's most elite communities. It was a case that had everything: immense wealth, a bitter divorce, illicit affairs, and ultimately, a brutal murder that would take years to solve. Thus is the story of how greed, passion, and betrayal collided on the fateful October weekend in 2001. Robert Theodore Ammon, known to everyone as Ted, seemed to have it all. Born in 1949, Ted grew up in the affluent suburb of Ridgewood, New Jersey. He was the kind of man who epitomized the American dream through education and ambition. After attending Bucknell University, the way he earned his undergraduate degree, Ted went on to obtain his MBA from Columbia Business School, one of the nation's premier business institutions. He was intelligent, driven, and possessed an almost innate understanding of finance and investment. By the 1980s, Ted had established himself as a major player in the world of leveraged buyouts and investment banking. He co-founded Culver Pramvis Roberts & Co.'s principal investment area, working alongside some of the most powerful financiers in America. Later, he became a founding partner of Chain Capital Partners, where his expertise in identifying undervalued companies and turning them profitable made him extraordinarily wealthy. By the late 1990s, Ted Ammon's personal fortune was estimated to be in excess of $40 million, a sum that would prove to be both his legacy and, tragically, a motive for murder. Ted's personal life seemed equally blessed. In 1986, he married Generosa Rand, a woman whose own life story read like a screenplay. Generosa had endured a difficult childhood, spending time in foster care and orphanages before being adopted at the age of 12. Despite these early hardships, she had transformed herself into a sophisticated woman who moved comfortably in New York's social circles. She worked as an interior decorator, developing a reputation for exquisite taste and an eye for detail. The couple appeared to be a perfect match. They adopted twins, Alexa and Gregory, in 1993, completing what seemed to be an idyllic family portrait. Ted was known as a devoted father who doted on his children, often taking time away from his demanding career to attend school events and spend quality time with them. Friends and colleagues described him as unfailingly polite, generous, and thoughtful, a gentleman in every sense of the word. The Ammons' primary residence was a stunning mansion in East Hampton, Hampton, located at 59 Middle Lane. This wasn't just any house, it was a masterpiece of architecture and design, a sprawling estate that Generosa had spent years perfecting. The property featured meticulously landscaped grounds, a swimming pool, and interiors that had been featured in design magazines. The house was Generosa's passion project, a testament to her transformation from foster child to society matron. But this beautiful house would ultimately become the scene of unspeakable violence. By the late 1990s, cracks had begun to appear in the Ammons' seemingly perfect marriage. Those close to the couple noticed increasing tension between Ted and Generosa. What started as minor disagreements escalated into bitter arguments. Friends later reported that Generosa had become increasingly controlling and temperamental, while Ted seemed to withdraw emotionally from the relationship. In 1998, the marriage reached its breaking point. Ted filed for divorce, setting in motion a legal battle that would consume the next 3 years of both their lives. What followed was not an amicable parting of ways, but rather one of the most contentious and expensive divorce proceedings in New York history. The divorce battle centered primarily on money, specifically how to divide Ted's considerable fortune. Generosa, who had signed a prenuptial agreement, contested its validity. She argued that she had contributed significantly to Ted's success and deserved a substantial portion of his wealth. Her legal team fought aggressively, and the proceedings became increasingly hostile. Court documents from the divorce reveal a relationship that had deteriorated into mutual animosity, with both sides making serious allegations against the other. Ted, ever the financial pragmatist, was willing to provide generously for his children, but balked at what he considered Generosa's excessive demands. He offered her settlements that would have left her a millionaire several times over. But Generosa wanted more. She wanted the East Hampton estate, her crown jewel, the house she had poured her heart and soul into creating. Ted, however, loved that house too, and refused to give it up without a fight. As the divorce proceedings dragged on through 1999 and 2000, both parties were bleeding money in legal fees. But there was another complication, one that would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. Generosa had begun a relationship with a man named Daniel Pelosi. Daniel Pelosi was, in many ways, Ted Ammon's opposite. Way Ted was refined and educated, Denny was rough around the edges, a blue-collar electrician and contractor from Long Island. He had a criminal record that included assault charges, and those who knew him described him as a volatile and aggressive individual with a hay-trigger temper. Generosa hired Pelosi to do work on the Middle Lane estate, and their relationship quickly evolved from professional to personal. By early 2000, they were romantically involved, a fact that scandalized East Hampton society and infuriated Ted. The contrast between the cultured financier and the hot-tempered contractor couldn't have been more stark. Friends and family members tried to warn Generosa about Pelosi, expressing concerns about his background and his obvious interest in her wealth. But Generosa, perhaps feeling validated by Pelosi's attention after the emotional devastation of a divorce, refused to listen. She was, by multiple accounts, completely infatuated with him. Pelosi quickly inserted himself into Generosa's life and, by extension, her ongoing divorce battle. He was present at legal proceedings, stayed at the East Hampton home, and began to love the lifestyle that Ted's money afforded. For Ted, this was intolerable. Not only was his estranged wife involved with a man he considered completely inappropriate, but that man was essentially living in the house that still partially owned and wanted to keep. The situation created a powder keg of resentment and rage. Pelosi openly expressed his contempt for Ted, making threatening comments to various people about the financier. Multiple witnesses would later testify that they had heard Pelosi say disparaging things about Ted and even make veiled threats. But in the midst of an ugly divorce, such talk was perhaps dismissed as just another symptom of a toxic situation. October 20th, 2001, was a crisp autumn Saturday in East Hampton. The summer crowds had long since departed, and the town had returned to its quieter, off-season rhythms. Ammon had driven out from his Manhattan apartment to the Middle Lane estate, still technically his property, as the divorce had not yet been finalized. He was alone that weekend, planning to spend some time at the house he loved. That Saturday evening, Ted attended a benefit at the Maidstone Club, one of East Hampton's most exclusive social venues. He was seen by numerous people, chatting and socializing, appearing to be in good spirits. After the event, he returned to 59 Murray Lane. No one knows exactly what happened in the hours that followed, but the evidence would later paint a horrifying picture. On Monday morning, October 22nd, Ted failed to appear for an important business meeting in Manhattan. This was completely out of character. Ted was meticulous about his professional obligations. Concerned colleagues tried calling him repeatedly, but received no answer. Finally, someone contacted the East Hampton police and asked them to check on him at the Middle Lane address. When police officers arrived at the estate, they found Ted Emmett's car in the driveway. The house appeared secure, but when they made entry, they discovered a scene of terrible violence. Ted's body was found in the master bedroom, lying on the floor near the bed. He had been brutally beaten to death. Medical examiner would later determine that Ted had suffered more than 30 blows to the head, delivered with such force that his skull had been fractured in multiple places. The murder weapon was believed to be a blunt object, possibly a flashlight or a heavy tool. There were signs of a struggle, and the ferocity of the attack suggested a crime of rage rather than a calculated execution. Perhaps most chillingly, Ted had been found naked, suggesting he had been attacked while sleeping or preparing for bed, completely vulnerable and unsuspecting. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators. This was not a random burglary gone wrong. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. This was personal. Someone had wanted Ted Ammon dead, and they had made sure of it. The Suffolk County Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation, but they faced significant challenges. The crime scene, while violent, yielded frustratingly little physical evidence. There were no fingerprints on obvious surfaces, no murder weapon left behind, and no witnesses to the actual crime. The estate's remote location and the late hour of the attack meant that no neighbors had seen or heard anything suspicious. However, investigators didn't have to look far for a list of people who might have wanted Ted Emmett dead. The contentious divorce immediately made Generosa Rand Emmett a person of interest. In divorce cases, especially those involving substantial wealth, the spouse is always scrutinized carefully. And then there was Daniel Pelosi, whose relationship with Generosa and antagonism toward Ted was well documented. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, both Generosa and Pelosi were questioned by police. Pelosi claimed he had been in Long Island that weekend, nowhere near East Hampton. He provided alibis and insisted he had nothing to do with Ted's death. Generosa, for her part, expressed shock at news, though her reaction struck some investigators as oddly muted given the circumstances. The investigation proceeded methodically. Detectives interviewed dozens of people, friends, family members, business associates, staff who had worked at the Middle Lane estate, and members of East Hampton society. They examined Dad's finances, looking for business enemies or anyone who might have had a motive beyond the divorce. They studied phone records, credit card receipts, and surveillance footage from traffic cameras in area businesses. What emerged was a picture of a man who had no enemies outside of his personal life. Ted Ammon was universally respected in the business world. He had no debts, no shady dealings, no disgruntled former partners seeking revenge. Every investigative path seemed to lead back to the same place, the divorce and the people caught up in its turbulent wake. As the investigation continued through late 2001 and into 2002, a stunning development occurred. Generosa Rand Ammon married Daniel Pelosi. The wedding took place in February 2002, just 4 months after Ted's murder. To investigators and to those who had known Ted, the timing was shocking and deeply suspicious. The ink was barely dry on reports about her husband's brutal murder, and Generosa had already married the man many suspected of committing that murder. The marriage seemed to confirm investigators' worst suspicions, but suspicion alone doesn't make a case. Prosecutors needed evidence, hard, physical evidence that could convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and that evidence remained frustratingly elusive. Meanwhile, what had gone? The divorce case was effectively settled, Esther's widow having reconciled legally before his death through the technicality that the divorce hadn't been finalized. Generosa stood to inherit a significant portion of his estate. The exact amount was tied up in legal proceedings, but it was clear that she would receive millions of dollars. To investigators, this looked like the oldest motive in the book, murder for money. But the case took another tragic turn. In the summer of 2003, Generosa was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. The disease progressed rapidly, and by early 2004, she was gravely ill. Before her death on August 22, 2003, Generosa made several decisions that would prove crucial to the case. She created a new will that left the bulk of her estate, money that had come from Ted, to her children, but Pelosi receiving a significantly smaller amount than he had perhaps expected. She also hired a prominent attorney to represent her children's interests, effectively cutting Pelosi out of major financial decisions. Perhaps most significantly, they were reports, never fully confirmed but widely circulated, that Generosa had expressed doubts about Pelosi in her final days. Though she never explicitly accused him of Ted's murder, she died without ever making a formal statement to police implicating Pelosi, taking whatever she knew to her grave. For nearly 3 years, the investigation into Ted Emmett's murder continued, but progress was slow. Then, in 2004, investigators got the break they needed. Advances in forensic technology allowed them to re-examine evidence from the crime scene with new techniques. More importantly, several witnesses came forward with information they hadn't initially shared with police. One crucial witness was an electrician who had worked with Pelosi. He told investigators that on the weekend of the murder, Pelosi had borrowed his vehicle, a specific detail that conflicted with Pelosi's alibi. Phone records showed that Pelosi's cell phone had been in the East Hampton area on the night of the murder, despite his claims that he had been elsewhere. Investigators also discovered that Pelosi had purchased a stun gun shortly before Ted's murder, a weapon that could have been used to incapacitate the financier before the fatal beating. While the stun gun itself was never recovered, the purchase was documented and seemed to fit the evidence from the crime scene. Perhaps most damning was testimony from people who claimed Pelosi had made incriminating statements. Multiple witnesses came forward to say that Pelosi had, in their presence, made comments that seemed to suggest knowledge of or involvement in the murder. In one reported instance, Pelosi allegedly said he wasn't afraid of going to jail because he had already gotten away with it. On November 2, 2004, more than 3 years after Ted Emmett's death, Daniel Pelosi was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest brought some measure of relief to Ted's family and friends, who had waited so long for justice, but the legal battle was far from over. The trial of Daniel Pelosi began in 2005 and quickly became a media sensation. The case had all the elements that capture public attention: extreme wealth, a bitter divorce, an affair, and a brutal murder. Courtroom observers packed the gallery, and the news outlets provided extensive coverage of the proceedings. The prosecution's case was largely circumstantial. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no witness who had actually seen Pelosi commit the murder. But prosecutors wove together a compelling narrative. They presented evidence of Pelosi's financial motive. He stood to benefit enormously from Generosa's inheritance if dead were dead. They showed his means, the Portland vehicle, his presence in the area, the stun gun purchase, and they demonstrated his opportunity. Ted was alone at the house that weekend, vulnerable and unsuspecting. Witnesses testified about Pelosi's violent temper and his threats against Ted. Phone records placed him in East Hampton when he claimed to be elsewhere. Forensic experts discussed the evidence from the crime scene, painting a picture of a brutal, rage-fueled attack consistent with Pelosi's known propensity for violence. The defense argued that the case against Pelosi was built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. They pointed out that no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon directly tied Pelosi to the crime scene. They suggested that the investigation had focused on Pelosi to the exclusion of other possible suspects, and that his relationship with Generosa had made him an easy target for law enforcement. The trial lasted weeks, with both sides presenting dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. In the end, it came down to whether the jury believed the circumstantial case was strong enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. On December 12, 2005, after deliberating for several days, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder, Daniel Pelosi was convicted of killing Ted Ammon. When the verdict was read, there were audible gasps in the courtroom, followed by tears from Ted's family members who had waited more than 4 years for this moment. In January 2006, Pelosi was sentenced 25 years to life in prison. As he was led away, he continued to maintain his innocence, shouting that he had been railroaded by a system that had judged him based on his background rather than the evidence. The murder of Ted Ammon and the subsequent conviction of Daniel Pelosi left behind a trail of devastation. The most tragic victims were Ted's children, Alexa and Gregory, who lost both of their parents within 2 years, their father to murder and their mother to cancer. They inherited the bulk of Ted's estate, becoming wealthy young adults, but no amount of money could replace what they had lost. The case raised important questions about justice and circumstantial evidence. Legal experts debated whether the prosecution's case had truly met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether the jury had been swayed by the lurid details of the case and a distaste for Pelosi's character. Some argued that a conviction represented justice finally served for a good man who had been brutally murdered. Others suggested that reasonable doubt existed and that Pelosi might have been convicted more for who he was than for what the evidence proved he had done. Ted Ammon's friends and colleagues established scholarships in his name, ensuring that his legacy would be one of education and opportunity rather than simply that of a murder victim. Those who knew him remembered a man of intelligence, generosity, and kindness, someone who had achieved great success but remained fundamentally decent and grounded. The East Hampton estate at 59 Middle Lane, once Generosa's pride enjoyed in the sight of such terrible violence, was eventually sold. The new owners renovated extensively, perhaps trying to erase the dark history that has soaked into its walls. Daniel Pelosi remains incarcerated in New York State. Still maintaining his innocence decades after the crime, he has given several interviews over the years, continuing to assert that he was wrongly convicted and that the real killer was never found. His requests for appeal have been denied, and it seems likely he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The murder of Ted Ammon stands as a cautionary tale about how wealth, passion, and greed can culminate in tragedy. Here was a man who had achieved the American dream through hard work and intelligence, who had built a fortune and a life, only to have it all end in brutal violence in the house he loved. The case demonstrates both the power and the limitations of the American justice system. It took years of painstaking investigation to build a case against Pelosi, relying on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony rather than the kind of physical evidence that makes for slam dunk convictions. Whether one believes justice was served or that reasonable doubt existed, the case highlights the challenges prosecutors faced in circumstantial murder cases. For the people of East Hampton, the murder shattered the community's sense of security. If someone like Ted Ammon, wealthy, connected, careful, could be murdered in his own home, then no one was truly safe. The case served as a reminder that violence can intrude anyway, even in the most exclusive and carefully guarded communities. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Ted Ammon murder is simpler and more human: the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and greed. Whether Pelosi committed the murder alone, whether Generosa was involved in some way that was never proven, or whether there are details that remain hidden, the fundamental truth is that a good man lost his life, children lost their parents, and a community lost its innocence, all because of the toxic combination of money, rage, and betrayal. Ted Ammon deserved better than to die alone and afraid in the house he loved. Justice may have been served with Daniel Pelosi's conviction, but no verdict could ever truly balance the scales or restore what was taken on that October night in 2001. The case remains a dark chapter in the history of East Hampton and a reminder of how quickly paradise can be lost.